What are the possible outcomes of this morning's Illinois Supreme Court ruling on the challenge to the state's gun and magazine ban? Well, kind of fascinating to game plan that, as we've got less than 3 hours before that ruling is released. Welcome back, Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY. Springfield's News and Talk. So I broke the news to the governor yesterday that the Illinois Supreme Court announced they anticipate to release their ruling in State Representative Dan Calkins' challenge that came from Macon County all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. That's after separate cases from Attorney Thomas DeVore secured temporary restraining orders, and even on appeal, the appellate court said that there's a likelihood that the case would advance on its merits. So Calkins' case essentially bypassed the appeals court, went right to the Illinois Supreme Court. Coming up, we'll hear some of the arguments of the Second Amendment and special legislation and equal protections arguments from that hearing in May from the Illinois Supreme Court and Jerry Stocks, who's Dan Calkins' attorney. But yesterday, again, I asked the governor about his thoughts on where this is going to go, especially since he's already acknowledged it's likely that the gun and magazine ban would be shot down, no pun intended, by the U.S. Supreme Court eventually. Here's the governor yesterday outside the Illinois State Fair grandstand.
Why sign the law if you had, if you know that it's a little bit better than 30% chance of survival?
I don't think that's exactly what I said. I was trying to articulate, though, that you just don't know what's going to happen in the federal courts, and that as of late, the appointees to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, are people who unfortunately want to take away the rights of parade goers and people who live in our neighborhoods to live safely and to not have assault weapons that are attacking their local communities. So I want to be clear. I don't know what the outcomes are going to be in court cases until they come out. I did not know until you just mentioned it that the Illinois Supreme Court is going to come out with their decision tomorrow. I'm hopeful, but no idea how they'll resolve it. It does matter what happens at the state level and state court, but ultimately the Supreme Court likely will be ruling on this. And so whatever happens there will ultimately, I hate to use the word trump, whatever happens in our state courts.
But you could also have whatever happens in the state courts trump some of the federal cases that are challenging the state's gun and magazine ban. So the different outcomes there could be. One, the Illinois Supreme Court says that the gun and magazine ban's unconstitutional and the law is no longer in place. That would make the temporary restraining orders that thousands of people across the state have null and void, not necessary. But it would also impact the federal cases. I don't think it would impact the local challenges that there are, for instance, Naperville, Cook County, Chicago, all being dealt with in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals with the federal courts. But that's one option. They could strike down the law in the Illinois Supreme Court, or they could uphold the law in the Illinois Supreme Court. And if that's the case, that would wipe away the thousands of temporary restraining orders that Attorney Thomas DeVore and State Representative Dan Calkins secured in separate lawsuits. So that's another outcome. But then that would still make the federal case very much alive and moving forward as we anticipate whenever the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals is going to release their ruling there. Or another option that the Supreme Court has, they could find something in the arguments and maybe say the arguments weren't ripe yet and then kick it back down to the lower courts to deal with specific questions that the Illinois Supreme Court may find. Some people may characterize that as possibly punting the case. So those are some of the possible outcomes. It's interesting that this also comes as you've got Vice President Kamala Harris going to be meeting with gun control advocates up in Chicago later on today. So all of this coalescing into making for an absolutely interesting day today when it comes to the gun and magazine ban. Again, they're going to release that ruling, whatever it may be, at 9 o'clock this morning. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter, and we'll be getting out the latest as that gets pumped out. Again, Bishop on Air. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, you can follow along. But one thing we definitely do want to get to is the attorney Jerry Stocks. He has, been in front of the Illinois Supreme Court now making his arguments. Here he is talking about special legislation with some of the justices on the Illinois Supreme Court.
The special legislation clause prohibits an arbitrary classification. And in this case, the classification is based on the training of the exempt individuals, and that they continue to maintain that training while they maintain their exempt status, as opposed to just everyone else. Is that an arbitrary?
It is arbitrary because consider this. A military veteran is trained, but he can't have that weapon to protect his family at home. A security guard may or may not be trained, but he has it only while he works. Heller and McDonald both say the Second Amendment elevates above all interests. It's not tolerating interest for a police officer, interest for a security guard, interest for a prison warden, interest for whatever, or here, the most glaring offense, for the grandfathered. There is no reason to conclude, but on an arbitrary basis, that the grandfathered are any better trained or safer than those that would acquire the weapon later on.
So again, Jerry Stocks there talking about how you can't carve out rights for some and rights for others just based on their job. So that's one of the major arguments in the Illinois Supreme Court is about special legislation and equal protections. Now, in the federal courts, they're dealing with the question on the Second Amendment and whether or not gun and magazine bans violates the right to keep and bear arms. But Stocks did say during May's hearing in front of the Illinois Supreme Courts that, the Second Amendment very much is an issue here. So here is Stocks making that case in front of the Illinois Supreme Court back in May during oral arguments.
When it's a direct challenge to the Second Amendment, Bruin, et cetera, are all about the Second Amendment. That's not what you brought. You framed this in a totally different way. You could have joined the three cases, the federal cases. You chose to shape it in a different way. About special legislation and equal protection. A much different analysis.
It is not. You cannot even begin to address the grounds that are in this complaint without addressing and finding what the Second Amendment says in this case.
So, again, that's some of the arguments that are being made and going to be considered by the Illinois Supreme Court when they release their ruling this morning. Now, another element to all of this, if you recall, Jerry Stocks, he filed a motion in this case to have two of the Supreme Court justices recuse themselves, Mary O'Brien and Elizabeth Rochford. They accepted in their campaign donations $1 million each from Governor J.B. Pritzker and six-figure donations from House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch, both of who are some of the lead defendants in this case. So questions of conflict of interest were officially brought up in this. I asked Governor J.B. Pritzker about that yesterday, so we'll hear that. We'll also hear the particulars of that motion that ultimately was denied because Rochford, O'Brien, and the court itself all denied either removing the judges from being able to hear the case or recusing themselves from being able to hear the case. So we'll get to that next here with Springfield's Morning News. I'm Greg Bishop on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. And again, follow me, Bishop on Air, on X, formerly known as Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and we'll keep you updated on the very latest.
Dealt with possible conflicts of interest with the justices. Can you just reiterate why you gave $1 million to each of the Supreme Court justices?
Well, that is not an issue in the case that they're deciding tomorrow, to be clear. It was brought up by some people who obviously...
The motion was made, and it was denied by both justices.
Because there was nothing to it.
So that's Governor J.B. Pritzker saying there's nothing to the questions of conflict of interest. I asked him about it yesterday after asking him about the anticipated outcome of the gun and magazine ban at the Illinois Supreme Court later on this morning. And I think that it's important that we do hear about what those questions of conflict of interest are because Jerry Stocks, the attorney in this case representing Dan Calkins, he did officially file motions to have Justice Rochford and O'Brien recuse themselves and to have the court keep them from hearing the case because Rochford and O'Brien received $1 million from Governor J.B. Pritzker each. and they also received six-figure campaign contributions from House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch, both of which who are lead defendants in the challenge that Dan Calkins brought. So let's hear Jerry Stocks. After the hearing in May and after the denial of those recusal motions, Stocks laid out really what's behind the argument and the concerns over conflict of interest. Here is Jerry Stocks from outside the Illinois Supreme Court back in May.
First, we have to see what the ruling is, and I have to respect the process and the decisions that govern that decision they made. But that was called a Caperton challenge, and Caperton says that a court of review must accord due process in the context of freedom from bias or prejudice on an issue, or motion in form, or the appearance of it. And Caperton, as a U.S. Supreme Court case, requires that to be an objective test. And so we personally feel that the orders that came back were subjective tests that imposed a burden of proving actual bias or prejudice. We would disagree with that, but it may not ultimately manifest in any impact in the case. That really cannot be measured until we see how the ruling is, and if the ruling is adverse, then we just have to measure and evaluate that at that time. I remain and stand behind the issues raised in that motion because I submit that it is the prudent course for our judiciary to be highly guarded on those issues. And I recognize that they got to be careful not to disqualify themselves out of every case. I mean, it's a tough call. And Illinois politics makes it really tough on judges because they have to be elected in this state. So I recognize those issues, but my personal view as a downstater is it's pretty darn corrupt in Illinois, and I know our perception downstate is that we want to see that the process and the institutions, not aspersions on the individuals, but that the institutions and our procedures do more to protect against that.
Could you take this to the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court?
We will evaluate those issues. I would say that the Caperton issues remain under consideration and viable.
And that's the Caperton is referring to the campaign contributions?
There are other components to that. It's not just the money. It's a threefold matter. It's from whom it came, being the other branches of government, and the independence and separation of powers concerned. 2, the amount. And 3, the reported pledge. We didn't say, we don't know what they said to the Political Action Committee. We know only what the Political Action Committee advertised they said. And they may, they had an opportunity and they deserved an opportunity to address that issue. And they expressed it, and I will accept that they were sincere in what they expressed, and that's what good judges would do.
So, again, that's Jerry Stocks talking about the concerns there are of possible conflicts of interest and how he could very much still take that case to the federal court system, challenging the question of conflicts of interest of the Illinois Supreme Court, because 2 of the justices that heard the case and are expected to be on one side or the other this morning when they release their ruling, they took $1 million each from Governor J.B. Pritzker into their campaign coffers last year before they got elected. So obviously there's some big things going on behind the scenes, and whether or not Stocks carries that challenge depends on what the outcome is of today's ruling from the Illinois Supreme Court about the gun and magazine ban. But you do have, as we've reported, various people who've attempted to get that issue in front of the Judicial Inquiry Board in Illinois, and it just hasn't materialized. People getting notes back saying that they have essentially closed their case and are not moving forward with their case. So fascinating to see that. But again, Governor J.B. Pritzker, when I asked him yesterday, please reiterate why you gave $1 million to these 2 Supreme Court justices when they were running for the office, and he brushed it off. He didn't think it was a big deal.
One of the issues in that particular case dealt with possible conflicts of interest with the justices. Can you just reiterate why you gave $1 million to each of the Supreme Court justices?
Well, that is not an issue in the case that they're deciding tomorrow, to be clear. It was brought up by some people who obviously...
The official motion was made, but it was denied by both justices.
Because there was nothing to it.
And he says because there was nothing to it. And if there was nothing to it, I mean, $1 million each, that's not nothing. So, again, will Jerry Stocks, depending on today's outcome, take his challenge on this Caperton v. Massey issue of, appearance of conflicts of interest? Will he take that to the federal courts? We'll be watching that closely and see if that ultimately does happen. But, again, 9 o'clock today, the Illinois Supreme Court set to release their ruling. We'll be watching and stick close to Bishop on Air on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and we'll keep you updated on the very latest.